Hello, everybody. Welcome back for winter quarter 2022. Can't think of a better way to start off the quarter or 2022 than with Onnie Rogers, who's a faculty fellow here at IPR and a faculty member in the Department of Psychology. Onnie does inspired and inspiring research on identity. Her work manages at once to be incredibly rich in terms of its conceptual focus and incredibly rigorous in terms of its approach. Her work is such a breath of fresh air compared to much of psychology over the last couple of decades, where these two things seem to trade off against one another and result in what many of us think of as kind of low-fat chocolate cake research, where it sounds rich and looks rich, but it's pretty dull on the outside. Onnie manages to really capture phenomena in the way that I think is very compelling, and then ask questions that are interesting and answer them in incredibly rigorous ways. So I will let her get on with her talk. Let me just cover a couple of quick suggestions and ground rules. One, if you have clarifying questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I will pass them on to Onnie if they are truly clarifying questions. If you have more in-depth questions, please save them till the end. We will have a Q&A period in the last 10 minutes. Again, submit those questions through Q&A and not through chat, please. So with that, I'll let Onnie go ahead and get started. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Greg, for that really generous introduction. And yeah, just really, really kind words. I appreciate it. It's a real delight to be here. It's been a long time since I've been at IPR and able to share with you all my research and some of the things I've been up to. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I also like to begin orienting myself in terms of the work I do. So I am a developmental psychologist, and I was trained in a school of education with a focus on culture and context. I also often mention that I stumbled into psychology by accident. I had always really intended to be an elementary school teacher, but was drawn into psych by questions about identity. My interest in thinking about how young people discover who they are, how they sort of imagine who they can become. And I think this starting point is relevant because it really informs how, excuse me, how I approach psychology, which is really from the lens of youth and young people. And so this began with thinking mostly about teachers and classrooms and sort of those immediate contexts that really influence young people. And over the last decade has really broadened to think more broadly about societal systems and stereotypes and inequities, our cultural values, and how that shapes human development and really what allows young people and just humans to thrive. And I think that question of thriving is really important because we live in a society that really wasn't designed for everyone to thrive, right? So in fact, it was designed for certain humans to have access to resources to thrive while others suffer. That's America's history, both past and present, from colonialism and violent theft of indigenous peoples and lands and communities, slavery, structural racism, white supremacy, the retelling of our very history, like we're seeing right now with the January 6th insurrection, right? The way society is structured, we see the persistence of patriarchy and sexism, the inequitable distribution of health and wealth and resource. You know, society is not set up for folks to thrive. And that's especially true for Black and Brown communities, Black and Brown youth. And so it really raises the question I've been thinking about is, how is it that young people thrive here? How is it that they survive and actually thrive? Because they do. Young people thrive, they struggle, but they also resist and survive and they thrive. And I know this because I've been doing research for the past decade with young people, white, Black, Asian, Latinx, multi-racial youth, different backgrounds, but I focused a lot on the lives and experiences of Black youth. And it's been listening to these young people sort of navigate their identities, how they make sense of who they are in the midst of structures of racism and sexism and systemic oppression and inequality. And while our cultural stories and often even our research about adolescents is focused on their problems and their troublesome behaviors and attitudes and how we can fix them, listening to young people, especially those that have been systematically marginalized in our society and in our science, has shown me that many of their problems are actually our problems, right? Societal problems. And we need to spend less time fixing young people and more time fixing the cultural norms, the systems, the context, the values in which youth develop. And so all of that might sound actually contradictory to the work I do, which is studying identity. I'm a developmental psychologist, I study identity. And now I'm talking about these big systems and conversations about structures. I think especially in psychology as a discipline, obviously we study individuals and people, but the study of identity is often really thought about this question of who am I? And how we describe who we are. And identity is complex. It involves our thoughts and feelings that we have about ourselves and others, the sort of stories that we tell about who we are and how we assign meaning to those. It's also reflected in our behavior. It guides our behavior, motivates action. It's also sort of reflected in how we behave. And identity has been like the foundation of all good things, right? So we have a whole vast literature that sort of documents the various ways that identity, this clear sense of who you are and where you're going, is an important foundation for well-being and learning and achievement, self-esteem, confidence, our relationships. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time sort of justifying that identity is important. From lots of different vantage points and sort of measurements, it is. I think the thing though for me that I'm most interested in when it comes to identity is how it manifests at that intersection of macro level societal issues and micro level, individual level development, if you will, right? So identity is sort of this collision of macro and micro realities. You know, the fact that the identities that we navigate are tied to social hierarchies and inequalities, structures of racism and sexism and homophobia and all the isms that we can sort of articulate. But they're also very micro level and subjective, right? We sort of make sense of our own identities and we negotiate who we are and what these sort of structures and systems are going to mean to us personally. Holding a given identity doesn't make you the same as other people who hold that identity, right? There's a lot of subjectivity and sort of micro level process. So this idea that who we are, our identities, are very much constructed within and nested in relationship to the people around us and the cultures that we live in. And so this question, who am I, is very much interwoven with the question of who are we, right? So no one answers the question of identity in isolation. And so while psychology has tended to focus on identity more as this individual level construct, this idea of a psychosocial view actually dates back to Erikson. So anyone who knows me in terms of my academic work knows that I still read and rely on Erikson in a strange way. His writing is far from perfect, especially when it comes to issues of diversity and equity and inclusion and those sorts of things on many levels. But one thing that resonates with me and the way that I think about identity and come to see identity through my work is he defined identity as this psychosocial process, really challenging the separation of individuals from society, but focusing instead on that intersection. And of identity, he wrote, you know, for we deal with a process that's located in the core of the individual and yet also in the core of his communal culture. So this dynamic, mutually constituted process of who am I being interwoven with questions of who are we as a culture, as a society. Now, I recognize this sounds a lot like maybe just context of development. And for most psychologists, when we think about context, we think about Brenners' ecological model, a very influential model in the field, obviously, one that I've used quite a bit in my work and refer to. It's useful for sort of contextualizing how we think about development in a field where for many years we just thought about the child individually. Bronfenbrenner gave us this image, this model for thinking about language and thought and emotion, relationships, all being nested within various layers or levels of an ecosystem. Now it was and still is critiqued as a model, justifiably so, because of the sort of white-centric norms that are baked into sort of our notions of neutrality of development. But I think more critically, or related to that, is the absence of power in the model. And so what often happens is at this outer level, right, the macro systems, where we have ideologies of culture, historical recognitions, these things are acknowledged and named. These are important differences that we need to think about in development and certainly control for in our statistical models or group comparisons. But what's often missing is a recognition that these differences are not accidental, that there is power and systems in place to actually uphold these inequities that exist at these macro system levels, right? So that racism and sexism are active systems at work. It's not just sort of a neutral difference to account for. I think a related piece that I've grappled with in my work is the visual structure of the proximal, right? That which is closest to the child, so the child's own biology, and then of course, family and school, this immediate context is often privileged over the distal in terms of our framing, our measurement, our interpretations of development. And so in my work thinking about identity, it's something that I've struggled with a lot, especially from listening to young people. So at this point, I don't know, for thousands of interviews with young people talking about their identities and their experiences. And what I find is that this macro distal context out here is not distal at all. It's very micro, it's very intimate, it's very proximal to how young people think about their identities. So we ask them questions about what it means to be Black, what it means to be a girl, how they experience these identities. And they're often telling us about societal expectations, stereotypes, and macro level ideologies and attitudes that shape their possibilities, their sense of belonging, how they make sense of who they are in this world. And so this idea that young people really pull in what Kate McLean and Moin Said refer to as master narratives of society to construct and articulate their own developing identities. And so as I was preparing this talk and thinking about that concept and how it shows up in my work, I realized that this actually comes through in a lot of the publication titles, because I do a lot of qualitative work, where we talk to young kids about what it means to be a boy or be a girl, and they say things like, I'm kind of a feminist. And that's like how they're trying to make sense and describe to us like what it means to be a boy in this world we live in, right? And young girls teenage girls who say, we're supposed to look like girls, but act like boys. Like these are the tensions that young people are grappling with in their identity processes. Talking to Black girls, we ask them about what it means to be a Black girl. And in a society with deep-seated colorism and intersectional stereotypes that wed their appearance, right, their skin tone, their hair texture, to their very value and personhood, these become central to how they're trying to articulate the challenges and possibilities of being a Black girl in this world. And so in essence, I feel like what we've learned listening to lots and lots of kids over the years describe their identities and explain what identity means and how it works, we've learned a lot about what kids know and about their experiences, but we've also learned a lot about our society, about who we are, about the values our society upholds, the inequities that persist, the stereotypes that prevail, who we are as a society. And hopefully, I hope this work also provides sort of a guide to who we need to become, right? So what I thought I would do today is share about a recent piece that we have. Last time I was here, I was looking back at my slides, we had just started doing this analysis where we were trying to understand whether and how kiddos were being impacted by or thinking about Black Lives Matter when they were just talking about their own racial identities. So this piece is now out. And I wanted to share some of the findings because I think it does powerfully illustrate this idea of the macro as micro, as well as how we've been incorporating that perspective into the research we do in the lab, the questions we ask, how we go about analyzing and thinking about identity. And then a little bit about how that's been shaping some of the conceptual writing and work I've been doing for thinking about the study of human development more broadly. I also love this piece because it was collaborative and student-led. It started with 2 students who were working with me for the summer. Josiah Rosario, who's second author here, he's a grad student here now. The other 2, Dayanara and Christy, have since graduated, but it was very much a lab project, a group project that we spent lots of time on over the years, and it's exciting to have it out in developmental psych. So it's a long piece. If you want to read it, feel free. I'm going to skip a lot to get through, but what I would hope to do is give you a sense of sort of the guiding question and frame our approach to contextualizing the analysis, and then some of the findings that we had present in the paper. So the guiding question was, to what extent does the sociopolitical context of Black Lives Matter show up in the way that kids talk about race and their developing racial identities over time? So again, this is like, how do we take this idea that the macro is micro, and can we see it really in the data systematically? The data for this come from a larger study that I've conducted. It was an interview-based study with kiddos in middle childhood, so ages like 2nd through 6th grade, and it was longitudinal, so we followed kiddos over a couple of years. And so this analysis is based on kiddos who we interviewed in 2014 and again in 2016. And you can see the sample demographics there. And so kids were in 2nd through 6th grade, mean age of 10 at year 1, and then 4th through 8th grade at the follow-up interview. All right, so in this analysis, we're looking specifically at kids' racial identities and how they talk about racial identity. And I'll just say that racial identity is multifaceted, complex, psychological construct. It involves a lot of different components, thoughts, feelings, attitudes that one holds about their racial group and racial group membership. We could do a week-long seminar on racial identity. So many people will disagree with what I have to say or have many questions about different theories and perspectives. I'm skimming over a lot, but the idea in terms of how I go about thinking about identity and measuring it is that identification, right, sort of knowing what label you have or choose, is one piece of it, but really not the interesting, if you will, meaning-making piece, which is where we focus a lot of our work. So how do kids make sense of these social groups and identities? The other thing to note is that a lot of the work on racial identity has been situated in the adolescent years rather than middle childhood. So this project and some of my work has really focused on thinking about the way younger kids start to grapple with these ideas and concepts, which is fortunately more generally accepted nowadays, that kids do notice race and are starting to make sense of it by the time they're in elementary school. They have those social cognitive capacities, and they're living in a context and a culture where they get messages about race all the time. So in this specific analysis, what we focused on is 2 dimensions or components or ways of thinking about aspects of racial identity. The first being importance. This is a construct in the racial identity literature that broadly refers to this idea that even when you're aware of a given identity, people vary considerably in how important that is to them, right? Like how central that is to your overall sense of self. We belong to multiple groups, have multiple identities, if you will. And so 2 kids who have the same racial identity in terms of, category might assign very different value to that general, to that importance of that identity to who they are. So importance is sort of an important metric that we use to think about how one makes sense of their identity. The second component that we focus specifically on is that meaning-making piece. So not just how important is it to you to be Black, but what does that mean to you? What does being Black mean? And we know that kids at this age can do both of these things, sort of think about relative importance, as well as ascribe meaning to these identities and have sort of stories, if you will, about what it means to be Black or white or whatever racial group they belong to. So there's two pieces here that we also were looking at in terms of change. One being developmental change. So identity broadly, and certainly racial identity, is conceived to be developmental, something that grows and changes over time. Again, with most of the work being situated in adolescence, those sort of developmental models and trajectories don't necessarily apply to young kids or haven't been sort of brought down to thinking about the middle child age. But generally, the sort of developmental trajectory is that as your identity becomes more developed, it's more important to you, you have more complex meaning making and understand sort of the social implications of your racial group. And so we might expect, right, as kids are getting a bit older, getting closer to the adolescent age, that we would see these sort of increases in importance and more complex meaning making. There isn't a ton of work to suggest, especially around importance, whether and how that changes during middle childhood. So that was something we were looking at. We also were looking across racial and ethnic groups here. So we were thinking about whether and how change looks different based on kids' social position in the hierarchy. So in general, you know that kids of color think about race earlier, tend to put more value on it than kids who are white, because in this structure, whiteness is often deemed just invisible and therefore not important. So we did expect to see differences in this sample based on kids' racial background. Okay, so what did we measure? How did we get at these constructs? As I mentioned before, this is an interview study. So all of the kids were interviewed individually. As you can see, the range of topics here. But what we focused on in this analysis was the section of the interview that focused on race. We're skipping around a few questions, but the two main ones that we'll be looking at findings for today are importance ratings. So we have a procedure for getting kiddos to think about their different groups, and we ask them some sort of relative importance type questions, as well as this direct question. They answer on a little visual Likert scale of how important is being Black or whatever racial label they had selected already to you, okay? And then the substance, I would say, is the meaning making and content of their race narrative. So this is across a handful of questions where we're getting at kids' understandings of race, how it shows up for them, how and why it's important in their lives. And then we analyze those narratives for various codes. So just to point out that none of the questions, as you can see here, were about sort of macro context, certainly not about Black Lives Matter. That wasn't the intention of the project. It wasn't really on my mind at the time of the data collection. And so the same questions were asked in both years. And so the question for our analysis was, you know, can we see the presentness of Black Lives Matter? Does that sort of salient show up at all in how kids are talking about their racial identities across time? Okay, so how were we able to sort of examine this at all? Well, it wasn't intentional, right? So the world happens as it does. We are doing our research and the world keeps happening. So these data, as I said, were collected in 2014, 2016. And for those who are less familiar with Black Lives Matter or BLM, you know, it began as like a hashtag and then transformed into what we see it now as this very global movement. Some may be thinking that summer 2020 was when BLM became a thing, but it actually began circulating social media in 2012, so after the murder of Trayvon Martin. So when the courts acquitted Zimmerman of all charges in that case, Alicia Garza, who's a longtime community activist, had posted a letter to the Black community on her Facebook page, just encouraging and acknowledging the transgression of injustice and encouraging the Black community. And one of her friends, Opal Tometi, had requested to repost that letter. And then she added the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And so that's when it first sort of came into the universe, if you will. But it wasn't until late 2014 that it really became a more global phenomenon. So I'm going to put up this visual, which maps onto our data collection and sort of how we began to think about our data. So you can see we conducted interviews during the academic year of 2013-2014. So our first set of interviews were finished in May of that year. And then we have the murder of Michael Brown, the acquittal, and the next 24 hours where 2.4 million tweets of Black Lives Matter hit, the tweets of all things. And that was really a turnkey moment for the movement. And then lots of things continued to happen. This little timeline obviously does not capture everything that happened between 2014 and 2016, including the presidential race that was happening at that time with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. But our second set of interviews with the same kids and the same questions happened in 2016. And so the question we were asking is, does any of this stuff happening out there show up in kids' own narratives at this more micro level of identity? Okay, so let me share a few findings. First, we're going to look at just change in importance, right? So is race more important over time? What does that look like? This is what the data look like, just looking at percentages, right? Like what percentage of the sample said not much or a little or a lot in terms of how important their race is. We see most kids say not much. This is across groups and ages, and this is pretty consistent with all of the literature. When you ask kids about their identities and how do they describe themselves, they scarcely say anything about race or racial background spontaneously. A couple of years later, how does this change? What do these percentages look like? We do see a shift. This is sort of a finding for the general literature. As I said, we don't know much about sort of change or increase or growth or what's happening in this importance type rating during middle childhood. And we do see this shift. Kids aren't just sort of going to the middle either of like, oh yeah, it's a little. We see a notable shift from the not much to the a lot sort of response just in terms of how important their race is. But we also were curious mostly about sort of the impact or influence of BLM and what was happening in the world at that time as the conversation and salience of race-based conversations also shifted significantly in the political sphere. And so because of the design of our study, kiddos were 2nd through 6th grade, right, in 2014. And we followed those same kids up. So we have 2 cohorts of 4th graders, 5th graders, and 6th graders, right, who are 4th graders in 2014. And then we also have 4th graders in 2016. Now, this is not a perfectly balanced design. Again, this was not the intention of the data itself. But we were able to think about how we might leverage what we do have. And we're looking at proportions of 4th graders in each year, right? To say, well, if it's about age mostly, right? 4th graders in 2014 shouldn't look much different than 4th graders in 2016. And likewise for 5th and 6th graders, right? If this is about sort of how kids grow in capacity to think about race just themselves, then we should see pretty similar patterns for these matched cohorts across the 2 years. But we find the opposite. So this is just one graphic. We have a few others in the paper for different analyses, where we see in 2014, we've got our 4th, 5th, and 6th graders here, just a proportion of kiddos who said race is really important to them. And then we look at 4th, 5th, and 6th graders 2 years later, different kids, right, but same grade level. And we see a pretty different pattern. So this idea of like, something else is at play. Something else is related to whether and how kids say their race is important to them or not. It's not just a quote developmental phenomenon, but contextualizing that and what's happening around. So this was surprising to us. It was affirming for what we were thinking. But again, we saw this across a few different metrics in the data, which is really exciting. And we also, of course, are in the same way thinking about context in terms of structure of racism and racial position. So as we would anticipate, our kids look different based on their own racial group. So we're going to look just at those importance ratings, but this time just using it as like a Likert scale with means. So we see that general sample difference of an increase overall. But when we break it down, it's really our kids of color. So we've got Black and multiracial kiddos in the sample, and they're the ones who are showing this increase in race importance across those 2 time points. And white kids are low overall and stay low. Okay. Now this again is on par with the general literature. So from little kids up to adults in this country, white people don't consider race to be very important. But one of the things we've been thinking a lot about in our analyses and measurement of constructs is whether and how importance is measured across these groups, right? So what does it mean to have high racial identity importance in a context of white supremacy and normativity? That does not necessarily mean the same thing as having a strong sense of your racial identity as a Black person or another person of color in this context. And so actually, Dr. Ursula Moffett did this really beautiful analysis thinking specifically about whiteness and white kids and trying to contextualize how we think about white kids' racial identity in the context of white supremacy and colorblind racism, and that really being important, also macro context for understanding racial identity development broadly. Okay, so back to this analysis. We didn't just measure, right, these importance, but we were also most interested in the content of the interviews and what kids were talking about, and whether we could see systematic change in how they were talking about race, and code for that across these 2 time points. So we used a couple of previous frameworks, as well as very data-driven framing for trying to think about how to organize the codes. And what we ended up doing for this is hearing the way kids talk about race at different sort of levels or orientations. So we know younger kids tend to talk about very individual level, concrete notions of race, right? So things like skin color. And the way that we were reading this in the data were these more individual level representations, right, of race, something about me as who I am. But then we also heard kids shifting in their conversations at times to talk about the interpersonal, which is sort of, how race exists between people in relationships and interpersonal experiences. So when kids say things about sort of how groups work together and what those interactions might look like. And these 2 levels are what we would generally expect from middle childhood sort of conversations about race based on prior literature. But we also heard and wanted to capture what we were calling in this analysis sort of structural conversations about race, this idea that it's not just something about me or something about this person I'm interacting with, but there's just something about the world we live in, right? Like recognizing how, it's just harder to be a Black person here, right? This sense that there's a structure in society at work. And then of course, BLM references specifically. So things that seem to tap into the broader narrative around Black Lives Matter and the kinds of macro level conversations one could say that were happening around race, such as protest and shootings, of course, explicitly, but where and how kids just made mention of these spontaneously in their interviews. So we code number of references as well as each case or kid who makes mention of these. I'm going to present just the cases. The data story is the same, but cases are 100 kids, so it's easy just to see. You can see most of the references, as we would expect, are these individual and interpersonal type responses. But the interesting thing for us was around the shift that we see in structural and BLM related responses. And so I'm going to show you all what that looks and sounds like in a second. But this to us, again, sort of suggests that there's ways in which what's happening way out there is very much impacting kids' own stories about what it means to be and move through the world in their racial identity positions. The other thing we coded for, as I said, we did a lot in this paper, but the other thing we coded for, which we noticed in their narratives, was not just sort of, were they the content or were they talking about race in terms of personal, individual, or interpersonal, but also sort of what they did with that information, how they negotiated encountering race. So these are the 5 codes that we had in that set of coding, and these weren't mutually exclusive. We weren't sort of trying to slot kids into particular buckets, right? We're trying to understand the tone and tenor of their stories. But one of the common ones was denial, right? So because I'm not racist and it doesn't matter what my skin color is. So this idea of just sort of like underplaying, and folks who are familiar with color evasion or colorblind ideologies, this idea that like, race doesn't matter because I'm not racist. Kids certainly say that. Another related one was this idea that race only used to matter, but not anymore. And so each of these sort of represented different ways that kids sort of rationalized, if you will, the topic of race or encountering race. So for the sake of time, I'm going to shift to presenting a couple case studies. So once we took all these narratives apart to code and make sense of patterns, the real story, of course, was in the story themselves, right? Putting those things back together to hear sort of how kids' identity shifted across these 2 time points. So you'll see some of these themes sort of peppered throughout the cases. And if you want to look at that specific coding findings more closely in the paper, you can certainly do that. Okay, so I'm going to do 2 case studies. I should have time. The first is Stephen. And so Stephen's a Black boy. He was a 5th grader, the first interview in 2014. And his case really illustrates a common pattern across a lot of those dimensions and codes that I just described. And we'll just read through it. So this is, we ask, what do you like about being Black? It says, we have a lot of stories about our culture. We have a lot of stories to look back on, and mostly the history stories are about Blacks and stuff. And what's hard about being Black? Nothing. You just can't count the color. What do you think it means to be Black? You have to be smart to be successful. Okay. We continue. How about being treated differently because of your skin color? No. Well, when you read about it in the stories, in the history stories. So why do you think it's changed since then? Because Obama became the president, our first Black president, stuff being changed. So Stephen sort of illustrates this, idea of race as skin color, not like oblivious at all to race, understanding the history of racism, the significance of having Barack Obama as president. But when we hear him a couple years later answer these same questions, we hear a pretty significant shift in how he orients towards thinking about being Black. Certainly, he's a couple years older, but also I invite folks to really hear the kinds of examples, again, in response to the same type of question, or same question. So in 2016, we asked, what does it mean to be Black? If you remember in 2014, he said it means you got to be smart to be successful. This year he says, well, it's hard because it's the cops that are killing us for stupid stuff. So like, if you think like the people that are supposed to help you are killing you, then imagine in 5 more years, it's going to be like your friends are killing you and then everybody is killing you. That's what I feel like. So if the cops are already killing us for doing nothing, then you might as well step out the door and get shot. How do you think things would be different if you weren't Black? I would get all the stuff. Nobody will look at me like I was a target. So it's a startling shift in content and tone and tenor. And certainly he's a couple years older, and we know in this society, especially, to be a Black boy who's growing up, that shift from being childlike to being adult-like is significant. But he's very much responding to what's happening directly, right? The structural realities of racism, the significance of feeling like his very life is threatened. And that's how he's grappling with and trying to make sense of what it means for him to be Black. And really underscores that the macro is very micro. And we consistently observe often the ways that young people challenge and resist and continue to persist. But at the same time, we see in Stephen's narrative the significance of what's happening around young people, very much shaping their very essence and how they're making sense of who they are. So the second case study I want to present is Ava. She is multiracial, biracial. In sixth grade, she also sort of shows the shift from colorblind ideologies. You know, she says, I think Black and white are least important to her. She's talking about her identity, because I don't think you should judge a person by the color of their skin. Like, you can't judge a person by the color of their skin, because that's being prejudiced and racist. So I feel like we need to judge a person by, quoting Martin Luther King, by the contents of their character instead of the color of their skin. So we heard a lot of kiddos, like adults, quoting Martin Luther King and the importance of content of your character. And in 2016, as an 8th grader, Ava's narrative shifts quite a bit, shifting to thinking about race as it impacts her world, given what's around her. So first of all, she identifies very clearly as multiracial in this interview, whereas before, you know, she talks about it not being important. She says, it's weird to call myself multiracial because it's not that I'm ashamed, it's just that I look white and I'm a white female. And I will never probably in my life have to face the prejudice that African Americans have to. And so I feel like calling myself that, African American, is somehow like being dishonorable to them and kind of offending them, or you, as I was interviewing her, I could say. But I guess that's not, I don't know, maybe that's not how it works. I don't know. Right, but so this is one of the examples where she's not explicitly talking about, you know, police violence and the Black Lives Matter movement, but we still see this very tangible shift in the content of how kids are engaging with race as a structural phenomenon that very much parallels the way race became far more prominent in that dialogue during that time. Okay, so I have just a couple minutes. A few summary notes from this analysis. So we do see this sort of longitudinal change in kids' racial identities in terms of importance and content. But it's not just about age, really it does seem to be related to how the world around them is shifting, and this idea that what's happening out there is significant to how and when kids think about their own racial identities and their own experiences. And for me, that's been important for thinking about what we presume matters to kids and is important to kids. Often these are conversations that we're not having with children at all. But given the content of what we just heard, we very much should be. We very much should be engaged with young people in this process. And so one of the things I've been thinking about in my work and in the work we do around identity is this sort of shift from thinking about the macro and the micro to really thinking about those as inseparable processes, because the process of separating them in and of itself is part of the challenge I think we have in understanding their inevitable intersections. So micro is this language that some colleagues and I, so Tiffany Yip and Erica Niwa and David Shea, we got to write this really fun piece thinking about a shift that we see in the field and a push for sort of thinking about systems of inequality, but also recognizing the limitations of some of our language and framing that inevitably separates the very processes that we're trying to understand. And so micro is this effort to visualize and really deconstruct those binaries to conceptualize these as simultaneously macro and micro. So the kids' development isn't just something that's like moderated by context, right? But like the very process of development is filtered through these systems, much like we see in this ELM analysis, where we learn a lot about kids' identities and how those identities develop. But it doesn't make sense to just say, well, when kids are older, they do this. But really, as we look at kids engaging with the world around them, this is how they respond. These are the ways that they're sort of negotiating that reality. And that becomes how we think about kids' development. And I think this is important in our psychological research more broadly, especially when we're thinking about policy and change and impact, because the proximal tends to overshadow the distal. And what that often means is that these ideologies of power sort of remain on the periphery of the conversation. They either begin to open the conversation or in the conversation, but they don't become integral to the question asking, the analysis, the interpretation. And I think that really matters, because we often end up, when we remove the power component, and sort of white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy get sort of put on the periphery, we often land on these more individual level solutions and explanations that invariably, even if not intended, tend to hold individuals responsible for getting themselves out of the systems, or at least contending with them. And there are real consequences to that, right? When the problem is really located in the micro, then our policies also tend to focus there. And this is, of course, a both and conversation, which is the whole point. It's not an either or. But for me, shifting the starting point of the conversation to center the macro first, right? To center white supremacy or racism, structural inequality as the starting point for the problem, shifts the way we ask questions and sort of interpret what young people are experiencing and how we need to support them, right? So that in my work has meant sort of thinking about young people. I do a lot of work on resistance and documenting and showing the way kids challenge and resist these toxic stereotypes and expectations, right? But the fact that young people and folks across generations do and can and will continue to resist and show resilience and persist despite these oppressive systems doesn't mean that individuals are responsible to do these things and are required to do these things to thrive, right? That like we have to earn our right to achieve and accomplish and exist in this very toxic system, right? So the shift is that those of us in positions of power in the system need to be accountable for doing kinds of research and calling for policy change that fairly, if you will, or more accurately locates the problem and responsibility into systems and values. It's seen in the fact that young people or humans were born with, the capacity for relationships and intimacy, craving curiosity, and then we grow up in a society that values individualism, strips kids of their empathy and cooperation, and then we develop programs to reteach them how to be kind and not bully. And so again, now kids are having to relearn something that's incongruent with the culture and a society that we've built. And so, it's this idea Michael Cole wrote about, the question is of social values, not individual responsibility. And so these are issues and tensions, and I doubt for sure that this concept of micro is a perfect solution by any stretch, but really the process of thinking of how do we develop the kind of language we need to shift our questions and the way we think about the process of development, so that we are able to more fully understand and support youth development in a way that values their inherent contributions rather than focuses on fixing their problems. And I think, in the process, what I've learned, is how much we learn about our culture by listening sincerely to what young people have to say about what it means to grow up here. So I'm going to say thank you to my team. This is an outdated lab photo. We did not sit out together. We aren't breaking rules. This is an outdated photo that needs to be updated, but my lab is the best, and we've got some of the most remarkable students who contribute to our conversations and the work that we do, and I'm really grateful. So thank you to all of you, and I will open for questions.